Today, we are going to be thinking with Arturo Escobar, a scholar whose work I think many of you know, and who has for a long time been engaged with trying to help us as thinkers, as scholars, but also more generally the development um, development corporation world to think again about our project in the world and how we might imagine more equitable distribution of life chances in the world. When we invited Arturo, I wrote a small letter to him to suggest why it is we were interested in his work. And I want to read a little bit about it. I said to him, Arturo, many thanks for agreeing to be a part of this in our Thinking with series. Your work for us, or the starting point for being interested in your work, goes back a little longer than your most recent book. For me, at least, it was already from your book, Encountering Development. This was at a time when our museum, the Tropo Museum, was involved in many development-oriented projects, as museums like ours have been doing. But we were not so aware of some of the hitches, the coloniality of the kinds of developmental projects that we were involved in. And your Encountering Development was a way out, or a way of thinking otherwise about what we might do in these global collaborative projects in which we were involved. But I said further to him that it is your more recent books, your book that tried to look at the question of design, and this latest book that imagines thinking about the pluriverse, that we were especially excited for. We are excited for the question of design because we have been interested to try and ask the question using the collections that we have. What might a design history look like differently if the starting point was not so much from London or Paris, but rather a starting point that was from Senegal or Jamaica or Haiti? We wanted to ask, what might a history of photography or a history of art look like differently if we were to decentralize Europe as the starting point for these thinkings and to reposition other nodes in how we reorganize knowledge, but also how we reorganize the material culture that emerges from different parts of the world. And for us, the collections that we hold was important for that. But it was also in the more recent book where we were interested in what you set out as how we might think of a radical interdependence, how we might think of how we together in a kind of commons can decolonize not only our museum, but be a part of decolonizing the very ways in which we've come to be and know in the world that we live in today. It is with that in mind that we invited Arturo to present on his most recent book, Pluriversal Politics. And to complement him, we've also asked a friend of the RCMC, someone who we've been thinking together with for some time now, Rolando Vázquez Melken, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University College Roosevelt. Over the next hour and a half, we will ask Arturo to present first his book, some of the thoughts from his book about why this book is urgent for the present. This will happen for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll invite Rolando to reflect on Arturo's reflection. And then we open for open conversation, a speculative conversation about what might a pluriversal politics do for imagining other possibles, other worlds, or another possible world that is not just only possible, but probably that is so urgent in the time that we live in today, which is one that, anyway, from where we sit in Amsterdam, one that is contested, but one where the tentacles of a certain kind of coloniality continue to ensnare us. And what we hope to do with this conversation and the others that we will have is to try and see if we can find tools, concepts, ways of thinking that could help us to imagine and to make real other possibilities for other possible futures. I'd like you to welcome me, help me to welcome virtually Arturo Escobar, just to think with us about how to imagine other possible futures. Arturo.
Okay, thanks so much, Wayne, for that great introduction. Thanks as well to Alessandra and Juliette for the invitation and support for this session. Thanks to Rolando, my good friend Rolando Vázquez, for being here at the session as well to comment on this book. And thanks to everybody who's joining us. Muchas gracias a todas y todos las personas que están en este momento en el mundo virtual siguiendo la sesión. All those of you who are virtually following this session. And the first thing that I'd like to say, and that I also mentioned to Wayne on email, and just before we started the session, is that I believe that what they are trying to do at the Center for Rethinking Museums is not only very radical and very political, but it's also super exciting, super interesting, and I find it very, very constructive. I think it's the kind of work that we need to make, not only to decolonize the multiple pasts that inhabit the world still today, especially those pasts of colonized peoples, but also to open up the possibility for multiple futures. And I think that's what brings us together today, is how can we have, again, in a lively and real way, this idea that we don't have to accept the one future that is offered to us by capitalism, by high technology, by the West, by heteropatriarchal colonial capitalism, whatever way we want to call that system, Babylon system, as Bob Marley called it at some point. In whatever way we call that system, one of the features of that system that has become very clear with the passage of time is that it forecloses the possibility of any other possible future. And it also, in doing that, occupies and colonizes all pasts and represents those pasts as either untrue or non-viable alternatives to what exists, or as something that has to be left behind so that the modern world can finally settle in for good and forever, so that modernity can become the only way of being, modernity in that way of that we know it today, of a globalized economic capitalist system. And so everybody who is opposed to that dream of one world, one globalized world, according to the laws of the market and individuals and profit and competitiveness and efficiency and so forth, then we need to engage in this task of making multiple pasts and multiple futures visible and possible. Okay. One comment about what I would call the sociology of production of the book itself, Pluriversal Politics. This is actually the translation of a book in Spanish that came out about 2.5 years ago in Colombia, my country of origin, which was titled then Otro Posible Caminando por las sendas de Aviala, Afro Latinoamérica. Another possible is possible. Walking along the paths of indigenous Afro-descendant and Latin American worlds or paths. And why did I write that book in Spanish? And then for the version in English, of course, I added that very long preface in English that I will talk about in a minute. Writing the book in Spanish was something that I felt more urgently, especially over the past decade. And I've been spending half of the year in Colombia over the past 5 years as well. But over the past decade, I started to feel more clearly the urge to write directly in Spanish. Almost all of what I have written in English has been also published in Spanish, all the books and articles and conferences and so forth. And there are things in Spanish that have not been published in English. So, but even knowing that, as I told the editor with whom I work at Duke, which is a wonderful person, Gisela Fosado, I told her that I had decided to write this book in Spanish, even if I knew that what doesn't exist in English doesn't exist for the Anglo-American Academy. Then I decided to just do it and write it in Spanish, all those essays. I guess she tried to prove me wrong because she proposed the book for translation in the series in which it came out. It's a series maintained by UNC Press and Duke Press for many years. They only published two books a year. Really grateful to Gisela for that as well, and for all the reviewers of the book. But to give you a sense of the context in which some of the chapters were written in Spanish before I talk about the preface and the book. For instance, I'll tell you that chapter 2, I think it is chapter 2, was written, for instance, for, and this is part of the preface of the book, of the introduction, maybe part of the introduction, there, for a very large gathering of Latin American social science center, Claxo. And there was about 30,000 people, about 90% of them were young students, college students from different parts of Latin America. And that is the context of Latin American scholarship, as in many other parts of the world, is one in which it's difficult to separate the academic from the political. I mean, there are academics that do most academic work with no political implications, or so they think. But there's a common practice for intellectuals and activists in Latin America to circulate between the academy, social movements, NGOs, the state, and being activists as well. So these hybrid activist, intellectual, academic spaces have been very important for the book in different ways. I could give you more examples from the different chapters, but I don't want to take the time talking about that, really. So to mention something about the preface, it was my attempt to respond to the comments by 3 reviewers, even if the book had been published in Spanish. The Duke Press sent it out for review. That's the normal process. And the comments were very thorough. One of them in particular was about 9 pages, single space. And the reviewer basically was very interested in asking the question whether this thing that I call pluriversal politics, a politics that is based on the idea of the pluriverse, a world where many worlds fit, the idea of the pluriverse understood as a vision of life as something that is always changing and creating from its own resources, is creating the forms and the practice and the institution, the behaviors that we have, and within that, obviously, humans create our conditions for living. That I call pluriversal politics. Then that was also in many worlds, the world where many worlds fit, as I mentioned before. Whether that was, and that was also based on the idea that there are multiple reals and hence multiple possibles, which is the more difficult proposition to understand of the book. Whether that notion of pluriversal politics could be articulated or could go along with more well-known forms of left politics, what in the book I call modernist left politics or counter-hegemonic politics. So the preface is my best attempt at sort of pushing that debate towards the pluriversal form of politics, but suggesting that yes, there can be articulations between conventional, let's say, established left politics, in the better sense of the term, as a counter-hegemonic politics, and pluriversal. Okay, so you'll see that in the preface, and has always been very important for me, my work in Colombia, the work that I've been doing for close to 3 decades now with Afro-Colombian social movements, and in the last decade or so, particularly with Afro-Colombian feminist movements, feminist intellectuals, activists, then to engage with that debate that I started to learn quite a bit about without considering myself an expert on it in any way, which in the US is called Afropessimism. And then trying to put that together with the more agency-focused works by Afro-Latin Americans and Afro-Latin American women, and in the context of the US as well, by some African-American feminists and Chicana feminists. So that's what you will find in the preface. And this idea then introduced in the preface as well, but developed throughout the book, and especially in chapter 1, I'm sorry, which is the only chapter in the book that you could consider to be a theory chapter, which is on this concept of relationality. And I'd like to talk for a moment about that, relationality or radical independence, which is a new way of understanding. It's not a new way. I mean, it's the way in which life has always taken place, on the presupposition that that everything exists because everything else exists, that everything is profoundly related, not only related, but also interdependent with everything else that exists in the world. That if you wish to use the concept, of instance, of co-arising, everything is co-arising, co-emerging, that life is this amazing process, amazing flow of forces and material and energy and words and spirit and feelings and emotion and materialities and everything else. And that radical independence is what really, really characterizes life, and not this modernist idea of separation, what is understood as ontological dualism, that humans are separated from non-humans, from nature, that mind is separate from body, that reason is separate from emotion, that things have an intrinsic existence in and of themselves. So this book argues against that. Of course, this is an argument that is based on many other intellectual sources, which you'll find in the book, from science of complexity to post-dualist social theory, to Buddhism and spirituality, but also from socialist struggles, from the field of socialist struggles. And at the intersection of these two things, socialist struggles for the defense of territories, people's territories against, especially against extractive operations. For the Latin American case, but in many parts of the world, extractive capitalism is the name of the game today. That those resistances in many ways, especially those from territorial-based peoples, indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, peasants, even in many urban areas, that those struggles that in many ways start as environmental conflicts, for instance, against gold mining, against the destruction of the forests, or rivers, or mountains, or lakes, or biodiversity, or what have you, are really also ontological struggles, meaning by that struggles of what it means to exist, what it means for life to take place, the kinds of things that makes life worth living. So at that intersection of social struggles and social theory trends that question the binaries of modernity, emerges this field called political ontology. It's a concept coined by Mario Blaser already close to 15 years ago, but only in print about 10 years ago. And that a number of people have been developing, myself included. So the book I suggest could be read as some sort of treatise, not treatise, but examples of political ontology, in the sense that it tries to foreground this way of understanding reality that we call radical relationality, radical interdependence, radical co-emergent. I mean, there are many ways to refer to that. And that we should then see life again from that perspective. And that if we see life again from that perspective, we realize that there cannot be a single real with a single truth. There cannot be this universals of modernity, of progress and rationality, that there are multiple rationalities, multiple ways of defining what is valuable, what is worth, and that's fundamental for resisting today the onslaught of development and neoliberal globalization, and now, you know, the drive to deepen the digitalized social life and so forth, so that we exist all within the earth as a living system. We exist within an earth that is alive, within a universe, and that's in many ways the crisis that we're facing, that in Latin American indigenous peoples they started to call a civilizational crisis in 1992, is a crisis of a particular mode of existence, a crisis of a particular mode of existence. And that if we want to face that crisis, then we have to mobilize those relational way of being and living and thinking again. And that perhaps, at least, that's what many groups today worldwide are trying to engage in the resistance to the monocultures of capitalism and heteropatriarchal, racist world systems and so forth. Okay. And finally, to finish in about 5 minutes, I'd like to talk a little bit about what this is, just very provisional and very, I don't know why provisional. Some of the implications that I can see for thinking about museums and taking the prompt from what the center is already doing, and by Wayne in his introduction. And I want that there's a proposition that I like to make, which is that designing is in crisis in a world that is in crisis. So we accept that there is a civilizational crisis, a crisis of the world, a very deep crisis. It's an interrelated crisis of climate, energy, poverty, inequality, and meaning, as well meaning. So we call it a civilizational crisis. Then design, which has been a central political technology for the creation of that modern world or contemporary global worlds, is also in crisis. So if we construe design, and hence made the analogy, museums, as being in crisis, maybe we orient and redirect design and museums to be at the service of transitions beyond the crisis, meaning by that, being at the service. So design and museums themselves would be in transition at the service of civilizational transitions. So 2 minutes to elaborate that idea, and then I conclude. Particularly museums of ethnographic collections. And so if we begin to see, and this is obviously what the center, the Research Center for Material Culture is attempting to do, which is really amazing, is to document the pluriverse, so that in the objects collected, pillaged in the context of colonialism, or in whatever way they were acquired, then we have the possibility, and I think Wayne mentioned this, there you find embedded a particular way of being and living and thinking, a ontology, a particular mode of existing, and that those worlds were complex, and hence the museum can approach the task of reconstituting those relational worlds out of which objects were taken in all of their complexity, in all of their relational complexity, and present those worlds as viable worlds that they were, and maybe as worlds that still have many things to teach us about viable futures that we might have today, and certainly, obviously, that descendant communities we have today, because descendant communities in many ways who have been at the forefront of fighting against the objectifying, colonializing museum practices have a great deal at stake in trying to decolonize museums, precisely to show, not just to show the horrors of colonialism and conquest and so forth, but precisely to show that those worlds which are embedded in those objects, decontextualized objects, are still viable worlds that they would like to draw on. So museums document the pluriverse. Museums also document the ontological occupation. They can do that. How was the ontological occupation and the breakdown of worlds? They can document particular worlds at relational worlds. And the concept, of course, of reparation could be very important in this respect. I always thought that reparation, obviously, and this had at least the debates in Latin America among Black activists in Latin America, is that reparations is not just about, money is not primarily about money at all, if it is about money. It is not even about, I mean, it is about memory for sure, but it is about the possibility of reconstituting those worlds and knowledges that have been actively suppressed, actively produced as worthless or as second-class ways of being or as non-existent. So that reparations is about bringing back the possibility, the possible futures of a relational world being strengthened today in its autonomy, in the way that those worlds want to continue to be alive in the pluriverse. So the concept of reparation has an ontological dimension. It's not just about objects. It's not just about money. It's not just about memory. It's a whole ontology that needs to be reparated. And hence, it has to do with repair, and it has to do with healing, and it has to do with caring, and it has to do with multiple pasts, out of which we can read the possibility for multiple futures. So the tasks that the museums are tackling today, at least at the center, is, I believe, extremely imaginative and important and caring and exciting, really. The concept of ancestrality, which is very important for indigenous and Black struggles in Latin America, at least. The fact that we all go back to our ancestors, or even for guidance for today, doesn't have anything to do with remaining in the past, as people often think, or as governments adduce. That's a complete misconstruction of that insistence on ancestrality. Ancestrality is precisely the possibility of making futures again possible out of that relational fabric that these worlds, indigenous worlds, Black worlds, peasant worlds, have been historically, and so important. So museums can be a political technology of defuturing at the service of closing down all the possible futures, or they can be a political technology of futuring and refuturing. Those are terms coined by Australian design theorist Tony Fry, very powerful terms, I think. They can reinscribe this idea of one single world, one single globalized village, so to speak, or they can be disrupt that and instead imagine, make visible, make viable, make possible a pluriverse, a world where many worlds fit. So that's I think, to me, the centrality that museums can have today, and the rethinking of the museums in the way that the center is attempting to do. Okay, I think that's what I wanted to say to start the conversation. So I pass it back on to Juliet or Alessandra or Rolando, I'm not sure. And thanks for listening.
Yes, you pass it on to back to me, and Rolando should start soon as well. I think if he activates his video, he will come in. I want to thank you first for what the book does, but also actually for tying the book to the work that we're trying to do, and also to provoke us to think again about what is at stake in the work that we can do. So the question of what might it mean to refuture rather than defuturing? What is at stake in a reparative practice that on the one hand must be also about the redistribution of resources, while at the same time might be invested in the making legible the viability of other worlds that were presented as unviable through our museum as practice, but through the colonial project. There are several questions that have emerged, and if you don't have to answer them now, one of the questions that emerged and you can answer later is a question about what you mean by radical when you use the word radical interdependency. And there's another question from the audience, which is around the question of scholars. Let me see if I can read it. Someone who LGBT academics who are working in this field primarily from the Latin American context. So those are some of the questions that we will ask you to return to later on. Oh, and it's now time for Rolando to speak.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? No? Okay. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you so much. I want to start by dedicating this conversation to María Lugones, who just left us this past Tuesday, who was a very close friend and teacher of many of us. She was a person that knew how to cross beyond the silences of violence and bring to voice forms of loving perception for us to inhabit the possibility of multiple worlds and multiple selves. So I think Maria would have so much to say about this conversation. And I see in one of the questions somebody recommending an author in this field, and I would very dearly recommend María Lugones. I want also to thank Arturo. It is really so beautiful to be with him. Arturo, we consider him our elder, and he has been a maker of paths of many, many of us, and he has always been bridging worlds together. I also want to thank the Center for Material Culture, Alessandra, Juliet, and Wayne for the sustained conversations and for opening these spaces. Well, I will try to keep to my 5 minutes. I already used half, possibly. Maybe some reflections mirroring what Arturo and Wayne were mentioning around the question of, maybe about the last question, the question of the museum. And what is the role of a museum like the Museum of World Cultures today, or the Ethnographic Museum? And as we see, the museum can become a very important site of questioning, as it is becoming in this conversation, because it is a place where we can witness the erasure of other worlds. Its collections are collections of silencing, are collections of the classification of the other, of the power of representation over the other. And from a decolonial perspective, the museum has been at the center of the production of whiteness as the default position of knowledge in the world. So for us to engage the museum, the Ethnographic Museum, in questioning has to do with engaging the question of whiteness, the question of how these museums were at the very center of the production of the idea of Europe, of Eurocentrism, and with the idea of the experience of Europe and Eurocentrism and of modernity in general. So it is possibly not so much a collection that could really speak of the worlds that have been erased and silenced, but it is definitely a collection that can help us construct this history, this hidden history of the coloniality that constructs modernity, and move us towards this necessary step of the humbling of modernity. If we are going to transit beyond the one world future that Arturo was speaking about, we need to pass through the humbling of modernity and through facing these institutions with their historical role in the production of whiteness. So the decolonial in that sense, and Arturo has been at the center of the conversations of the decolonial, is concerned with relationality. So what Arturo mentioned, so relationality we see as having the possibility, and this is one of the greatest things of Arturo's book, having the possibility of going beyond critique. In Western Euro-centered thought, critique comes to a death end. It leaves us with no alternatives, or it leaves us in a cynical position, or in a sense of powerlessness. Whereas when we engage with this bridge that Arturo is making to the worlds in resistance and that have been reproducing the joy of life across the planet under conditions of coloniality, then we see that relationality holds so many answers for the possibility of going beyond the modern model or the Western model of civilization. So the reconstruction of relational worlds is not something that needs to be designed or reconstituted. It's something that needs to be listened to, because these worlds are alive and they are not contained in the collections of the museum. Because as I said, these collections tend to be more focused in creating the experience of the white gaze, in creating the white spectator. I will finish with the question of temporality, this one last minute I have, and is the question of defuturing that in conversations with Tony Fry, we see through the decolonial as defuturing not being the question that there is no futures possible, but being precisely the question that comes through the destruction of ancestrality. So when we read the problem of defuturing through the decolonial understanding, we see that defuturing means that the more we keep on destroying the ancestrality, the heritage of Earth and the heritage of relational worlds, we are impoverishing the possibility of the future. We are impoverishing the possibility of becoming other, because I often use in my classes the example of extinction. When a species gets extinct, there is no more path towards the future. And this is what has been happening under 500 years of colonialism and of the project of modernity, the severing, the cutting of the paths towards the future. And that is why ancestrality is a radical return to transform the present. It is the remembering back the possibilities of producing alternative worlds. And in all this thinking, it is thanks to Arturo and all these beautiful network or communities of thought and of learning each other that we can translate these thoughts and bring them today at the center of the debates of white institutions in Europe and in the US. So I'm really grateful that this conversation is happening now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are you hearing me?
Yes, I hear you.
All right. And Arturo, can Arturo also join? Hi, Arturo.
Yes.
All right, brilliant, wonderful. So we have a few people online, and I mean, we can get into their questions, comments a little later on. I wondered if we could start out by a certain kind of conversation between us, a response, for example. And one of the things I'm interested in, and the intention here is not necessarily to only foreground the museum as the necessary site from which to think, right? We think as Rolando just articulated, that we are actually just one in this node of coloniality that exists, of knowledge power production that exists, and therefore for us to decolonize, we have to be a part of decolonizing a broader system, right? One of the things that Rolando brought up, which I think is interesting, is the thinking about the questions of critique and what going beyond critique. And I wonder if you want to reflect on that. And my reflection, my invitation to reflect on that is also to ask the question that between a relationship between the museum or the university knowledge production as a site of critique, in line with, conjoined with a site of the imagination, a site of where one can imagine, and how those two things are conjoined or even stand in the way of one another. So I want to think through that, going beyond critique, and think it in relationship to questions of the imagination and the possibility to imagine and make real other worlds, other possibles. And I wonder if both of you could riff on that a little bit, and then we'll come back to another question about the humbling of modernity. You first, Arturo.
Okay. Great question, Wayne. Thank you. Thanks, Rolando, for the comments, which were very, very interesting. And I have some, not disagreements, but I guess constructive counterpoints. You know, I like to use the concept of counterpoint in music, in the musical sense, which is you take a note that a musician, I guess, produces, utters with her instrument or his instrument, and then you elaborate it in a different way.
Yeah.
But we'll start with Wayne's note, and which started with Rolando about critique. And I completely agree, and I will rephrase it in this way, is what is the challenge to the contemporary academy? Sometimes I said it in a very harsh way, and so please take it with a grain of salt. Sometimes I say that the academy is one of the forces of occupation, of ontological occupation. It's one of the main forces of ontological occupation of people's lives, categories, and territories. Why do I say so? Because it's the academy that trains the experts, economists to begin with, but also scientists, engineers, anthropologists, sociology, geographers that go then on to colonize with the categories and the translations into the logocentric language of the academy, those words. Of course, there are spaces of dissent within the academy. There is always dissenting imaginations within the academy, but taken as a whole, and the more elite the university, I think, the more this applies. Thinking about, for instance, the US Ivy Leagues, they are great apparatuses for colonizing people's lives and experiences through the creation of categories, discourses, imaginations, visions of the future, and so forth. So I think the great challenge to the academy today and to critique is to, as Rolando put it very well, is to go beyond critique. And go beyond critique, that doesn't mean that we have to forget about critique. Of course, we need to keep on doing critique. But also join critique with I think Rolando put it in terms of a sort of a reconstructive thought, reconstructing thought. And Wayne put it very well when you say, Wayne, that we need to think about the university not only as a site of critique, but also as a site of imagination and making real those other imaginings of the world. And making it real means, goes back to the question, the famous binary between theory and practice, goes back to that separation that I think a big challenge to the academy today is to rejoin, to re-articulate the question of praxis, to don't let academics off the hook with thinking that because they write from a left perspective, they are being the great revolutionaries that academics really have in a practice, in a political practice, in a practice of transformation. That doesn't mean you have to go out and agitate. We have to do it beginning with our bodies, with our homes, with our communities. We have to contribute to relocalize, to recommunalize, to depatriarchalize, to deracialize, to decolonize, to all those different things every day from wherever we are. And that can be part of our academic work. Now, I don't think I have the illusion that the academy is going to transform itself as a whole. It will continue to be the same with design. Design will continue to be what it is for the most part, but that there are, and maybe I will link this with one of Rolando's comments in a counterpoint, that there is more and more what I find interesting in design critical thought, in critical design studies, is this idea that design is about the production of life and the making of worlds. Design is about world making. And I think Rolando is absolutely right in saying that those ancestral worlds and those indigenous worlds today, and maybe other worlds, relational worlds today, shouldn't be designed, but they have to be listened to because they are already ongoing worlds. They already exist. And I think yes, but my response to that as well, my counterpoint is that, but every single word today is thrust into the modern, is thrust into the global, is thrust into the defuturing. And as such, it cannot avoid going through something that might resemble design in some fashion. And I will just leave it at that for now, because I spoke too much already for this, just the first answer, but will be a topic to be continued.
Thank you for that. I want to come back to that a little bit, but let me give you the opportunity to answer the first question from the audience, from our audience. Could you please, the person asked, could you please elaborate a bit on the radical that you use when you use radical interdependency? What do you understand by the concept, by radical interdependency?
Okay, let me see if I find very quickly a couple of images to share. I don't know if I'm going to find them easily. If not, I'll just let it go. And then I'll share my screen, just a second.
Thanks to Juliet and Alessandra who are operating the technical systems. Juliet,
Okay.
they should be able to let you share the screen. So
Okay, so Juliet, I'm going to try to share my screen. Thank you.
all right, brilliant.
Let me see. This is in Spanish, but sometimes I use paintings, art, what I call relational art. This is from a young woman artist from Colombia, Vanessa Roa, Angie Vanesita. These amazingly beautiful paintings. The cover of Pluriversal Politics is actually done by her as well. So, oops, sorry. Oh, yeah, I lost it. Yeah. So what this painting suggests to me is precisely that radical interdependence, in the sense that here is a human that is also water, and is also mountain, and is also seeds, and is also trees and forests and air and sun and everything else. And that the human is with the earth. We don't exist independently of that. The radical is not a political radical, if you wish, philosophical radical, it's an ontological radical. It's a radical that means that the concept of Ubuntu tries to get at that. The Southern African concept of Ubuntu, that I am because you are. We exist because everything else exists. Let me see if I find, this is a painting by, that illustrates the concept of endosymbiosis by Lynn Margulis, and which is an amazing concept. For Lynn Margulis, this biologist, life is relation and interdependence from the get-go. From 3.5 billion years ago, when life started with bacteria, life was made by interdependence and by interrelation. This is another beautiful rendition of the same idea. I mean, and there's a lot of that in art, which is the human, the woman territory, woman tree, woman snow, woman mountain, woman fish, turtle, condor. There's another beautiful one by Angie Vanesita as well, by Vanessa Roa. The woman mangrove. I mean, that's for me is the idea of radical relationality. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'm going back to here. And so the other thing that I wanted to mention in terms of radical relationality is something that you find. Marisol de la Cadena has a very nice paper, and I'll write down her name in the chat in a moment. Well, I don't know if I can send it to everybody here, but apparently not. Ah, yes. Is Marisol de la Cadena. Has this great paper, it's a Peruvian anthropologist in the US, about a woman who has been resisting eviction from her territory that is coveted by one of the largest gold companies in the world. I find the same expression in some resistances against extractivism in Colombia by Afro-Colombian women, which is that they say that they don't move from the territory because they are the territory. They are the lake, and they are the river, and they are the forest, and they are that. Without that, they are not. Simply, they are not. So the sense of radical relationality to me. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for that. I want to, because there are a lot of questions coming in, I wonder if both you and Rolando, there's a question if you could recommend the work of some women and LGBTI academics in your field of work. And I think that in a way, what this person is also asking, which I am interested in as well, is in the kind of citational politics that we participate in when we start thinking about, you know, who are the not ignoring to cite the women who have been working in this field, or LGBT scholars. So Are there some that you want to name for some of the people who are online? Rolando, you want to start?
Well, I already put the name of María Lugones in the chat.
Yeah.
She wouldn't identify herself as LGTB because she thought of the category being produced through Anglo categories of sexuality and gender. But she is definitely a person that challenges the binary of gender and including the idea of gender. So that the necessity of going beyond gender to think of the plural self and the possibility of crossing to other worlds of meaning. So this for me would be the key reference here. Maybe to add to the comment of Arturo in conversation of critique, in this musical sense of counterpoints.
Counterpoints, yes.
What is very important in the sense that critique doesn't, so critique is very important to us, but is insufficient. Because when the task is, for example, the task of healing, then critique comes very short to bring you into healing, to bring you into dignity. Critique helps you understand the system of power that is affecting everybody, as Arturo says, but is not sufficient to what, again, María Lugones will call to go beyond resistance. So when you're thinking, when your life is framed in resistance, you are still enclosed within the logic of the dominant power because you are only in resistance to it. But the resistance that produces joy, that produces other worlds of meaning, is a resistance that goes beyond critique, that goes towards the task of healing, towards the task of the production of the joy of life. And that is where relationality becomes so important, and where critique is just one step in the humbling, in the necessity of overcoming or understanding oppression. But you don't go beyond oppression by understanding oppression. You need to go beyond critique. And that's where relationality, that is a term that comes from other ontologies and other philosophical systems that come from outside the Western epistemology, give us so many tools to foresee that possibility of going beyond critique. And with the term radical, I think the paintings that Arturo is showing us, they also show something that is very important to us when understanding the radical. The radical in its etymology has the term root. It is about being rooted. So when we speak of a radical return, we are speaking about rooting back, to what has been lost, to what has been separated from. So for us, the radical is not a radical novelty as if it is separated from the present. The radical is a call for rooting back, for recognizing, remembering ourselves earth, remember ourselves community, remembering the ancestrality of our existence today, which is not a mythical thought. It is a thought of recognizing our precedence, where we come from, all of us,
There is a question that ties a little bit to this. And somebody says, thank you, Rolando, for mentioning María Lugones and bringing her into this conversation. Her landmark essay, Playfulness, World Traveling and Loving Perception. She notes that in order to move to other worlds in a non-antagonistic manner, we need to, quote, lose our form of reason and be open to other manners of being in the world. So the question is, could you both reflect on how this can replace a notion of Eurocentric critique? The person says, simply said, how do we move through the pluriverse? How do we move through the pluriverse? Arturo, you want to take that up?
Okay, I was trying to read the question again because it's a complex question. But the last part, how does one move through the pluriverse? I mean, that's the biggest challenge. when we, as usually, you can think, I mean, I think it's in the book, Designs for the Pluriverse, I start with saying, from the time we wake up we get up to the time we go to bed, everything, our daily existence, is an existence that negates the pluriverse. Because we move and exist in a world that has been structured according to the ontology of separation. We need in a world that is operates on the basics of the presupposition of that we are individuals alone, and we have swallowed that truth without much questioning, even if we know it's not true. I mean, when we love another person, we know for sure that we are not the kinds of individuals that we think we are. So moving to the pluriverse and losing your own way of thinking, going beyond your own way of thinking, so that we can begin to think other thoughts, which means we can begin to be otherwise and act otherwise, is precisely beginning by questioning the daily practices, the quotidian practices through which we are actively constructed as separate individuals, separate from the earth, separate from the spirit, separate from other individuals. And it has to do with design. I mean, the design of a space. The suburban home in the US, for instance, the typical suburban home. Sometimes I give the example. It's a stereotype example, but I think it's an archetypical example, I think, as well. Existing or living in a suburban home in the US, the large house where every individual has his or her own room with his or her own TV, and now with the cell phones and everything else, in isolation. When you get in with your two-car garage and you don't even know your neighbors. And on the other hand, at the other extreme, is the collective lone house that you find in the Amazon or in Papua New Guinea, for instance, where indigenous peoples and Amazonian peoples can live up to 30, 40, 50 people in one single space. And that doesn't mean that everything goes. There are rules of behavior. But in the first world, the spatial design, the design of a space is such that it can only create a society of individuals, decommunalized individuals, delocalized individuals, which cannot really care for the network of interdependencies that they construct them as well. In the second, in the longhouse, in the Maloka world, the result is completely the opposite. It's a communalized individuals in which individuals are always persons in communities with humans and non-humans and spirits and the ancestors and jaguars and so forth.
No, I want to hold on to that a little bit, because in a way, one of the things that I want to use this point as a critique of Rolando's point, because in a way, what you propose in terms of the longhouses and those modes of being are also collected in the ethnographic museum. And Rolando suggested that those themselves those kinds of possible paths or possible ways of being might not be found in the ethnographic museum. So I want to hold on to that for the end, where we spend the last 10 minutes talking about the museum. But there is a question here which I think is going towards, the person asked about the relationship with the nation state. And the person says, can the nation state as it is currently constituted contribute to a refuturing, a birthing of the pluriverse? For example, many people critique the way that Ecuador and Bolivia have incorporated Buen Vivir of Samak Kwase into their constitution. But does refuturing require a complete departure from the infrastructure of the one world? And I want to ask that because, going to your question, Rolando, as myself a thinker from a different kind of decolonization practice, a practice which thinks that we are conscripted in a particular kind of modernity that might be unstoppable. My question is how do we fight against the current infrastructure that current infrastructure that is so overwhelming that one could say, for example, that left Stuart Hall very despondent in his last article, because he, if you read that last article, it felt as if he said, capitalism has won. In all of this fight, it has won. So how do we deal with this infrastructure in which we now live that perhaps foreclose the possibility of a return that you are imagining, Rolando, or whether or not we can inhabit a space outside of the nation state? That's what I get out of this question. Rolando, you want to jump in there?
Okay. Maybe I will connect it to the previous question, if you don't mind.
Good, good, good.
I have Maria in my heart at the moment. You know, this question of world traveling and playfulness and going beyond reason. So in my understanding, when Maria is proposing that, she's saying that the reason, here reason is the Western reason, you know, the Western modern reason, the rationality of Western modernity. And she would say, she said it several times in the summer school, that just last week, that within this reason, this Western rationality, women of color like her had no voice. They could not see themselves. They could not speak through that language. So it is through the perception, an embodied perception, sometimes even through the anger of the body, that she will move towards a coming to voice, that is a coming to voice beyond that reason. So that world traveling implies exceeding what Western epistemology and Western aesthetics can comprehend, because they are precisely made in a way that they erase the voice of the other, of the racialized other, of the colonized other. And that is a necessity of going beyond the reason of the West. That is the very same reason that sustains the museum, for the last conversation you want to have. And I think I think here with Arturo, it will not be a counterpoint, but just a harmony. I think when we speak of the pluriverse, or the possibility in Mexico will be called autonomía, we are not imagining something beyond the state as a utopia. We are just witnessing, we are listening to experiences that have been made by the peoples in the world, in this case, for example, Chiapas or Oaxaca, that are living communal worlds in all practical terms outside the state and actually in resistance to the state, but much more beyond resistance, creating and recreating communal realities that are preserving land, that are fighting off mega projects, the destruction of earth, and that are creating autonomous worlds. This is not an indigenous utopia or any romanticism go back to pre-Columbian times. It is a reality being lived today that is completely silenced in the mind and in the gaze of the reason that Maria is telling us to overcome.
Okay. Arturo?
Yes, no, my answer actually is very similar to Rolando's.
Good.
In the sense that I was going to mention autonomy. So the question of the state is a very complex one. Of course, I think there is some sense, it still makes some sense to struggle to democratize the state, socially, politically, epistemically. And activists do that all the time. In Latin America, at least, they cannot not engage with the state. Because in many ways, the state still dictates the conditions within which they live and struggle. But the more radical project, as the Zapatista put it, the Zapatists even say, we don't want to change the world, this world, we want to create a new one. And so they are creating, we could call it, I don't know, counter infrastructures. A different political organization, system of political organizations, Junta del Buen Gobierno, the bodies of good government, the caracoles, sort of autonomous communities, autonomous territorialities, They are trying to, in a way, decolonize or liberate the basic dimensions of life: to eat, to learn, to inhabit or to dwell, to move, to transport, to know, from their having been taken over by state experts, modern experts, obviously capitalism and so forth. So the best, at their best, relational politics will contribute to building and strengthening autonomous communities. I usually say autonomy or autonomy is the correlate of relocalization and recommunalization. For instance, it's so important today to relocalize food production or autonomy. So many activists call that food sovereignty, or food autonomy, autonomía alimentaria, soberanía alimentaria. It's so important today to rebuild communal, to reweave communities. Anywhere we are, in Amsterdam, everywhere we are, to reweave some sense of being communal, to oppose the radical de-individualizing pressures of global capitalism. But you cannot do that, especially peoples in territories cannot do that without autonomy, because they will be reabsorbed, recaptured, reinscribed within some sort of global capital, which is what happened, for instance, with ecotourism. Ecotourism, even at the beginning, was a strategy of many movements and communities, but it was soon very refunctionalized or recaptured by sort of capitalist market circuits of tourism.
I want to do something to ask two questions that are very specific to you, Arturo. There's one question. The person says, if we extend the idea of sentipensar to academic practice, moving beyond the ontological dualism between reason and emotions, what are the implications for how we do research, construct knowledge, and in academic spaces that continue to be shaped by positivist ideas? That's one question for you. And then I'll come back to another question, but if you want to enter into that one.
Okay, very briefly. Francisco Varela, who is one of the people I draw on a lot for thinking about knowledge differently, talks about what he calls embodied reflexivity. Embodied reflexivity. And I'll put the name in the chat in a moment, but it's in the book. And what he means by that, he is not saying that we need to reject, let's say, positivist or Cartesian rationality altogether. We need to resist its hegemony. And we need to accept that there are many other sources of knowledge, including what he calls embodied reflexivity, which involves its own way of being reflective about reality, about what is going on. But it's not, doesn't operate on the basis of the distancing, the epistemological distancing that is central to Cartesian epistemology. So we have to welcome into our writing, our richest projects, those ideas. And scientists know this. I mean, when scientists talk about intuition, that's a form of sentipensar. We have to let our research also be moved by care and love and the need to contribute to healing the web of life that has been destroyed. And so in that sense as well, I think is very important to harbor, to open up spaces for these other ways of knowing within the academy.
All right. Can I ask Rolando, just to go back a little bit earlier to your thinking with and about the museum, and you know, also because if we were to trace the histories of the museum that we are a part of, the Tropo Museum in which I sit right now, one of its traces is that, you know, it was one of the places where race was studied. So it has a race biology section in it, a physical anthropology part in it. So it was a space where not only for the study of, but the promulgation of ideas about race was a part of it as well. And those collections are part still of many ethnographic museums. Working from your decolonial perspective and working with the work of Arturo, whether or not it's a book on design, on development, or this book, what for you is, again, you mentioned it, is the promise of this kind of museum for a radical kind of politics that is future-oriented, for anti-racist futures or whatever? Is there a project that this museum can be invested in your view, with all of its problematics, that can be a radical politics that it can be imagined in?
Well, thank you, Wayne. Yeah, I think it is an answer that is also, I was also thinking about it through the other questions, and that has to do with the methodology of the decolonial. And the methodology of the decolonial is very importantly inspired by non-white feminisms centered in positionality. You know, so speaking of autonomía in Oaxaca or Chiapas doesn't mean you will create a Junta de Buen Gobierno in Amsterdam, you know? So it is not a universal project, you know? So what is true for the creation of the Lakou in Haiti, of the counterplantation system, of the Maroon community, is not a recipe for the world, you know? It is an acknowledgement that there is an outside of modernity, that there are other forms of thinking and living and experiencing life that are lived, that are outside the white gaze. They are not in the white imaginary, as a museum will be that place that constructs that white imaginary of the other as passé, as backward, as non-modern, as etc., etc. But then the question comes, if the museum is to do something, like the museum sitting in the imperial centers, if the museum is to do something, it has to start by its own positionality. What has it done? What is its history, its own material history, you know? It is not so much about the history of the others. I mean, I agree with Arturo that most of the objects in the museum are testimony to other ontologies, but the museum knows almost next to nothing about those ontologies, has never heard them, doesn't understand them, you know? But the museum can understand why they were doing that. And I think that has been unthematized, which is the production of the white imaginary, the production of whiteness. And in this sense, this collection and this politics of collecting and exhibiting the other is fundamental to understand the constitution of a racialized imaginary that became dominant, that became a tool of legitimizing enormous violence across the planet. So I think that history of the museum needs to be told, and that can be told. And the museum would become a very important site for this questioning, you know, where I think going to great thinkers like Toni Morrison, the question of race is a question of whiteness, right? How it constituted itself as a norm, as unthematized. How can you have a museum speaking about the peoples of the world without speaking about yourself, where you become invisible, you know? So who grants you that power of collecting, that power of representing others, that not to say classifying and studying the other, you know? So for me, this is the possibility that those sites grant us, you know, because they have the material to question that history of epistemic and aesthetic violence that has been complicit with the erasure of rules. I think one of the phrases I love the most about Arturo's work that comes in many, many of his texts in Spanish and in English is the phrase that globalization come at the expense of relational worlds. And obviously the ethnographic museum sits there at the center, you know?
We must wrap up soon, and I'm going to have to apologize first of all to the many questions that were never answered because there are many questions. But I want to take up something that has been that has animated our discussion just now, and it is a thing that I've been struggling with myself, and it came in a question. The question was, I think, how I could formulate it was about the possibility of hope. The possibility thinking hope in any ways? And I think that question, I think, articulates with a certain language that we've been using throughout, where we've been speaking using words of care and of love throughout this conversation. And so I want to ask us to reflect a little bit about that kind of politics of hope and the possibility of fashioning hopeful futures, or even hoping in this kind of moment. And the person, I think, ties the idea of, how do we hope? Is this hope to be gained from the global south? I think the person says. So I want both of you to perhaps reflect on that, this moment that we now inhabit, and our ongoing conversation that have been mediated through questions of care, careful and caring, through questions of hope, through questions of love, and what it means to mobilize these terms as we try to imagine and make real other possible futures. Arturo?
Okay. It's interesting that I hadn't really thought about putting together care and love with hope, but I think they definitely belong together. If we take it in a sense, if we follow the insights of relationality in a profound way. And by the way, I usually mention this, that Buddhism in many ways has been dealing with this question for 2,500 years. I mean, Western philosophy has been thinking about relationality for much, I mean, basically since the invention of, I guess, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind. Though some people go back now to Spinoza and so forth, there are a new set of authors that have been recovered to think about relationality. But radical interdependence, if we accept the insights of radical interdependence, an ethics of care and love follow. And hence an ethics of hope have to follow. Not only, I mean, the Buddhists would put it in terms of impermanence. I mean, some of the lessons of Buddhism are not only interconnectedness and interdependence, but also impermanence and compassion. So it's an ethics of compassion. Ethics of compassion has to be an ethics of hope, because we're all in this together, as you would say colloquially. I mean, we all are within the pluriverse. What happens to anybody, to any living being anywhere, it happens to us as well, to everybody else. So hope is, it becomes super important. I think I was trying to look very quickly, but I couldn't find it. There is Argentinian scholar, Ana Cecilia Dinerstein, who is now in the UK, who is writing very interesting things about hope and care. I think she's articulating on the global politics of hope, I think. So you can look at that as well. And the last thing that I say is sometimes we need to play around with Gramsci's old formula, optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect, or pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And sometimes I say what it needs to be, optimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. That doesn't mean that we have to do away with critique. We have to do the critique. But a critique, again, going back to the initial point by Rolando, a critique that is an enabling critique, a critique that doesn't disable hope, that doesn't let you off the hook easily. Hope is a radical politics, and it's the politics of healing and repair and love as well.
No, I just got the sign that we need to stop. Rolando, you want to join in one last minute of 130-second response to that?
130 second.
Yes.
I fully harmonize with Arturo in that we are foreseeing or working for a movement from the disabling condition of indifference and indolence of the individual towards a politics of compassion. And just to quote Professor Mogobe Ramosé, we think that the possibility of hope lies in the not forgetting, in that justice will come. So not forgetting is the possibility of hope and the possibility of dignity. And that is a radically different hope from the hope of constructing a utopia, an artifice. It is the hope of bringing justice. It is a hope of compassion.
Yeah. All right. Now, I feel badly that we have to stop because we could go on forever. But as I hear it, 1.5 hours is the maximum that you can manage on a Zoom conversation. that makes it harder. I want to thank you, and I also want to propose that we continue this discussion because I think that there are so many things that we picked up which need to be further drawn out, thought through again. And perhaps we could do this if we can talk about it actually in writing, that we could have a set of, probably we could write letters together or to each other where we explore this in even further. Now, you have started out for us, Arturo, Ronaldo, our Thinking With series that will continue next week, Wednesday, when we invite Michael Rothberg to think again about his new book, The Implicated Subject, which for us is another important idea, concept that we want to think together with. And later on, we're going to speak again to Macarena Gomez Barris, where we will talk about questions of extraction, extractive zone, and the ways in which both these concepts animate the work of us as museums. So we are interested in these ideas, in teasing out these ideas. And to all of those who've been watching, we would be interested to hear from you as well with suggestions for other ideas that we could think with, other scholars that we could think with, other objects that we could think with and think about. And hopefully you will be a part of the other discussions that we will have as we try to imagine whether or not it is from the ethnographic museums and its collections, or it is from the many scholars who we will think with over the period. We will try to imagine and make real other possible futures, to make other possibles possible, or at least, as you both have articulated, to give voice to, or to acknowledgement to, actually, that is what it is, the other possibles that are ongoing, that we have suppressed as museum, but also as this Eurocentric Western colonizing force that has suppressed so much in the world. I want to thank you both. Until next time.
Thanks, Wayne, and everybody.
All right.
Thank you, Wayne.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Arturo.
Thank you.